Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. The first thing you say is, this is not a history book. What does that mean?
Look, I chose to start the book that way because this book is geared toward younger people, and younger people don't like to read history books.
Right.
And so you start off by saying, don't worry, this is not a history book, and then you okey-doke them, right? And the other part of it, though, is that we talk about history as if it's in a bubble. But the truth is that history is perennial. It runs through our lives every single day, and it's more about it being a present book that history actually impacts.
That's really interesting because that has been fascinating reading through this. I didn't know what to expect. You know, you read books that tell you about the history of America, you read books that only focus on racism today or maybe even Jim Crow, but this book really just takes you through everything in a way that seems like it's palatable. Like, has it been designed in such a way that you can just read it and understand without feeling too much? Is that what you've tried to do for younger readers?
I mean, racism is historical. And what that means is it's rooted in the past, but you can constantly see it operating in your daily life, and you can constantly see how it's going to operate tomorrow. And that's what we wanted to sort of show for young people, that this history book is in the present. It's operating in the future, so they can understand their everyday lives.
When you wrote the book, you know, the two of you came together, Jason and Ibram, and you worked on this, telling this story of racism, and you have such short chapters in the book, which is really interesting. It doesn't follow the formats of a normal book. Sometimes a chapter is 10 pages, sometimes it's longer. Sometimes the way you write on a page, like the words pop out, they change. It really does engage you in a certain way. Were you trying to break the mind and how it's consuming information when you created the book?
For sure, but I'm also trying to make sure that we're working with the realities of young folks, which is an overstimulated world, right? I can't compete with cell phones, video games, YouTube, Fortnite, and all these things that they have going on with their lives every single day. My job isn't to compete, though. That's a silly and futile argument. My job is to work with those things by creating multiple stimuli within the pages of a book. Why not?
Why? That's brilliant. I think without even realizing it, you might have hit on another opportunity. You just add like an expansion onto Fortnite that just teaches you about racism.
Exactly.
So you have like skins from the past, and then kids can learn. There's like challenges.
Don't give too much away.
That's next up.
Ibram, young people are going to read this book, and some of them may feel deflated. They may go like, man, racism was so bad back then, so bad during slavery, so bad during Jim Crow, segregation, etc. And it feels like it's so bad today. How can I maintain hope in this world? You know, whether as a black kid or whether as a kid who's not black and going like, I'm an ally, I want this world to be a better place.
So that's why we didn't just want to write a history about racism. We wanted to write a history about anti-racism. We wanted to show them how people have been fighting against anti-racism from its origins. And people are fighting against it today, and they can be a part of that fight. And here is essentially how people have done it in the past, here how they've been effective, and here's how you can be effective today.
My Vanishing Country. Tell me what the title of the book means, and if you really feel that way about America.
Well, sure. I mean, my life has been bookended by tragedy. I say that with a heavy heart. From the Orangeburg Massacre and my father being shot in 1968 to the Charleston Massacre. And throughout the book, we talk about different traumas and different heartaches and different systems of oppression that people of color have to live through, that I have lived through. And so now with coronavirus and it ripping the Band-Aid off the healthcare disparities we have, I'm able to parallel that with growing up in a community where we don't have clean water, where we don't have a hospital, where we live in a food desert. And then you layer that with the sad case of Ahmaud Arbery. And you just talk about the perpetual trauma that people of color, particularly black men, have to live through. And so my Vanishing Country, it means a few things. We give the word country some meaning, being a boy from the dirt roads of the South, but even more importantly, those truths that we hold to be something that all Americans can realize seem to be fleeting, especially for poor people, immigrants, and people of color in this country.
Yeah. You would think that people would just go, yes, this is America's history, and these are some of the effects, the systemic problems that still affect black people today. And yet it seems like people disagree on it more than ever. If somebody is saying to you in good faith, really, hey, Bakari, I don't understand why black people seem to think things are bad in America when they've gotten so much better, how do you respond to that person if indeed genuinely they don't see it and they're trying to see it?
Well, first of all, this is probably the most difficult conversation that this country has to have. It's a conversation of race. And take, for example, the Ahmaud Arbery case. This is not a Trump era phenomenon. This is not something that just started to happen with the racism that emanates from the White House. Instead, I think about Medgar Evers. I think about Emmett Till. I think about Jimmy Lee Jackson. I think about the 4 little girls in the Birmingham church. And so when you think about the totality of these circumstances, you realize that we've made a lot of progress, but we still haven't reached that quote unquote mountaintop. We have not made it there. One of the funny things that people like to bring up is, oh my God, we had Barack Obama elected president. You guys have made it. And that's not the case. When you talk about these layers, I'm not concerned about somebody calling me nigger. I'm not. I'm more concerned about the systemic levels of oppression that people of color live in today. A broken healthcare system, a broken environmental justice system, a broken criminal justice system, a broken educational justice system, because in this country you're punished because of the zip code you're born into. And all of these pressures they just rest on you and they build your anxiety. And now we have Corona, and now we have these never-ending traumas. It seems like you're just trying to breathe sometimes.
Your book, The Vanishing Half, is truly one of the most amazing stories. You've set the story in the Jim Crow South world that has come into DC, let's say. So it's 50 years ago, and it's the story of twin sisters who run away from home and then go into a world where, although there are twins, they are identical twins, one of them is lighter than the other, and so she chooses a path where she passes as white. And that is literally the jumping off point of the story, where, I won't lie, when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is going to be a book about, racism in the South or slavery or this. And then I was like, okay, no, it's about Jim Crow, but it's still, there's going to be a white man who's, and it's like, no. I haven't read many stories like this. It was a beautiful book about black people tackling the issues of race and colorism and the ideas. Why did you choose to frame it like that? It was a really interesting idea.
Well, thank you, first of all. I think for me, I wanted to write a story about those nuances within a Black community. I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that the more interesting story is conflict between Black and white people. But for me, really, I've always said the most interesting thing to happen to Black people is not necessarily white people. Often the more interesting stories and the more complicated stories are within our own community. So I wanted to think about the effect of colorism, which is a result of white supremacy, and it's a result of that type of ideology. But what does this colorism do to people, and how does it affect the choices that these characters are able to make in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a country where literally shades determined your life, I'm seen as being, during apartheid, it was like, I'm technically superior to my mom and I'm inferior to my dad, and yet we're all in the same family. And what I loved about this book is you write in a way where the characters themselves start to understand how people perceiving them can determine their way in life. When you think about race and when you're writing about it in the book, is it interesting to rewrite the story of like a ridiculous thing that was created and then like try to figure out the rules through the eyes of these characters?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that was so interesting to me, was the absurdity of all of it, the absurdity of these rules, the idea of what does it even mean to be Black if it's not looking, quote unquote, looking Black? What does it actually mean for these characters to be Black or to be white? To what degree are they performing race? And how are they sort of creating or deconstructing themselves in a different way? So I think writing this book, and which takes this idea of colorism and really pushes it to a very extreme, but looking at it from that really extreme lens gave me a way to kind of see the absurdity of race and all of its nuances, even now and when I'm growing up and when I'm alive, which is a very different time period than the book is set.
Oftentimes when we read stories, especially in the Black community, of a Black person trying to pass as white, that story is written from a place of judgment. Oh, of course you want to act like you white, you want to act like you better, you want to escape, you want to be better than us. And in this story, it was more like just a person going like, hey man, I've made these decisions, I grapple with them, and as a reader, we're just forced to live with them grappling with that. Why did you choose to write it in such a way where it's like there's no you judging, it's just you portraying what they're going through?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think a lot of passing stories are very moralizing. The idea that the character who passes is deserving of punishment, often death, in a lot of these stories. And I think for me, first, I just didn't find that interesting to condemn somebody or to ask, is it good or is it bad to pass? That was just an uninteresting question. But I think also there's a weird way in which those stories kind of reaffirm the racial hierarchy by punishing a character who has transgressed in some way. So I objected to it from a level of interest kind of standpoint, but also from a kind of political and moral standpoint. I wasn't interested in judging these characters. I just wanted to think about what do you gain and what do you lose in deciding to become somebody new and to leave your community behind and create a whole new identity.
The story speaks about racism in schools that are being closed on Chicago's South Side. It seems like a problem that many politicians would claim is just a financial issue. You are a teacher, you are somebody who's worked in this institution. What is the problem itself?
Well, the problem is that in America, we have two different standards for what kinds of education we want to offer young people. And so if you have money, or if you have access to private school, or if you live in an affluent suburb, you get access to a certain type of education. And if you are poor and you're a person of color, especially if you're black, you get access to a different type of education. And so when policymakers are making decisions about kids in those types of schools, the kinds of schools that I write about that people call failing schools, terrible schools, there's a different set of standards.
And when you look at those different set of standards, how do they affect the kids? Because when I was reading through the book, there were instances and stories that really go back further in time than you would ever think the problem begins. You know, you'd think, okay, let's just talk about the school. But you argue that you can't just look at the school, you have to look at everything that led up to the school. Why?
Well, this is America, where we know that our country is founded on a history of institutional racism and chattel slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and so on and so forth. And it may seem strange to bring those things up when you're talking about a set of school closures that happened in 2013. But basically, the argument I'm trying to make in the book is that in order for us to understand the way schools operate now, we have to understand that history. And it's not that long ago.
Right.
And so I wrote a book that's about 2013, but it begins in 1916 by talking about the Great Migration and how black people came to Chicago. And I think that that's something that's not just about Chicago, that's about the country we live in. And that in most places, if you look at the history of how the city or the town got to be the way it is, there's racism in the mix. Spoiler alert, just because America.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people shut down in America as soon as you bring up racism or race. As soon as you say that, people are like, oh no, here we are again with racism. To those who argue that this is less about racism and more just about money, they say, well, Eve, it's not about black or white, it's about rich or poor. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's simply not true, and that's the first thing I would say. And that we actually know that segregation breaks down across racial lines, both in housing and in schools. So black people, affluent black people in this country are more likely to live in low-income black neighborhoods than they are to live alongside white affluent people. Low-income white people are more likely to live alongside white affluent people. And because that's the way housing breaks down, that has huge implications for the kind of schools that we have.
Right.
We also know that we don't actually save money through school closures. And so the kind of budget argument doesn't really stand up. But I think that it is uncomfortable for many people to talk about race and racism. And part of what I also wanted to do with the book is to help people understand that racism is a structural thing. It's not just about what's in your heart or how you feel or our interpersonal interactions. It's kind of the air we breathe.
How not to get shot and other advice from white people.
Yeah. Well,
where did the book come from?
Well, I was on Megyn Kelly's show. Remember when she was at Fox before she stopped being a racist and moved to NBC? And we had this heated argument, because there's never been, I think America has never seen a young black man or woman killed by the police that were so appalled that were driven to action. And it was a very frustrating conversation. Rather than get frustrated, I wrote a book about it.
And you wrote the book from the perspective of somebody who's taking the advice that you've seen doled out by white people repeatedly after a shooting or after an incident. It's always advice on what black people are doing wrong.
Well, white people have been getting advice since we first got here. So, I figure they're adept at it. But it's like when I hear these things, like these nonsensical arguments, like white supremacists, we want our country back. Like, as I recall, when you had the country to yourself, you invited us to the party. Like, we didn't book a cruise here because we heard they was hiring. Get on the boat, they're hiring in America. It's just, people have these warped notions of what they would do, and if you would just cooperate, or if you would. But I think that ultimately people just aren't uncomfortable with black people or people of color being killed by the police. I think they think that that's how it's supposed to go. No one likes to see a cow mutilated, but they don't mind eating a steak.
Do you think that, that speaks to, in many ways, you know, Black Lives Matter and what the conversation was about, is that we've gotten so used to seeing black bodies traumatized that as people, you know, both black and white, we have lost the notion of what the value of a black person is.
Well,
like to a certain extent, like you know.
I don't know that we can say America ever had it. Like that's
interesting.
That's really, like, even now when the football players are on strike, everybody goes, "Don't do that when there's a time and a place to do it." But the only time white people watch black people is if we're singing, dancing, running the football. Like that's like the other times they're not gonna particularly pay attention to us. And I think nobody has more invested in black people being treated fairly than football players. Like,
right?
Because if you're big, you're black, you're fast, you're strong. That works great on Sunday, but on Monday.
That's like you're in the wrong place.
It's the reason they acquit.
Right. You had an encounter with the police when you were what? 8 years old?
Well, 8
that was
years
your
old.
first. That was your first encounter with the police.
Yeah, I was 8 years old. I grew up on 135th and Avalon. I'm coming from school, getting a free lunch in the summer, and the police pull up and they pull up to me and my friend, and they're asking us questions about a cat that lived in my neighborhood. And they're like, "Where is he?" And like, "We don't know." And they like, "Put your hands on the car." And I said, "Sir, this car is hot." And he said, "Nigga, if you take your hands off this car, I'm gonna blow your head off." Now, I'm 8 years old. Flash to, a couple of weeks ago when a young kid in Chicago, 10 years old, is handcuffed and peeing on himself.
Right.
And I think that was my first experience, and I'll never forget it, and I'm sure he never will either.
Hood feminism is a really interesting title, because some people might be like, is there a different type of feminism in the hood that we don't know about?
I think that there is. I would argue that feminism in the hood is really about survival and less about becoming CEO and more about becoming, a person who can afford to keep your house, stay home for 2 weeks during coronavirus, and generally feed your kids through that process.
Right. It's interesting that you say that, because many people have said that the term feminism itself is starting to lose its power, because everyone has a different definition of what it means. Some have accused certain waves of the feminist movement of leaving black women behind. Some people have said that feminism itself, mainstream feminism, doesn't think about all of the additional factors facing certain people. What do you think needs to improve? What is hood feminism if you think about applying it to everybody?
I think about it this way. If we made sure that everyone who is currently on the margins is centered in our work, and we make sure that they've got housing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Housing, food, healthcare, we make sure that people have access to education and opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's a better world for everyone, right? So your answer for, we want to reduce crime, well, make sure people don't have a reason to be criminals.
Right.
We want to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. Make sure people can stay home for 2 weeks and be paid a living wage.
Right.
And be able to access groceries and medical care and all of these things. Like, every answer basically boils down to, if we're going to do feminism for all women, we have to make sure that the poorest women have everything they need to survive. You can't fight for your rights if you can barely stay alive.
It's interesting that you bring that up in the book in a completely different way, because you talk about it from a personal perspective. Mm-hmm. You talk about it as it affects people today. How did your life define how you think about feminism?
So I was raised by my grandmother, and I was one of those kids who we would now casually say was at risk, right? And it was fine. I didn't, go to jail or any of those things, but I married a guy who was not great.
Right.
And then I got a divorce. And one of the fun things about getting a divorce when you've left an abusive relationship and you don't have any money as a single parent is that you find out really quick whether or not you have a safety net.
Wow.
Right? So I lived in the projects. I went to college. I'm a U.S. vet. Mm-hmm. So I went to college while living in the projects and raising my son. My ex-husband didn't pay child support, yada, yada. So there was food stamps and Medicaid and all of those things. I was one of those people we always see talked about as, someone who's siphoning from the system.
Right.
Except I had paid into the system. I got help from the system, and I promise you I pay more in taxes now than I ever got.
That's a great success story. It's wonderful that you came from that place to this place, but it's also interesting that you don't stop looking back and going like, I'm lucky.
Because here's the thing. If you say, well, I made it out, no, it's just me, everybody else has to make it too, mm-hmm. You sort of ignore the people who helped you make it out.
Right.
And B, you just keep the problem going. There was always another girl like me. There was always another parent like me. There's always another person who is struggling. And we honestly do ourselves no favors when we don't take care of people who need a hand up.
If someone's reading your book, they may come away from it feeling like you're saying all is lost, it's a zero-sum game, and there's almost no point. But I know you as a person, and I know that although you challenge the ideas of America, you're not one who doesn't believe in inaction. So what action would you want people to take once they've read your book? What is the idea that you're trying to get across to people?
I think this the very first thing for me, as I'm challenging sort of the narrative that Americans have told themselves about America, right? It is saying, we keep saying over and over to ourselves, America is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. America is the beacon for democracy. And it's just like, well, those things just don't stack up if we look at the record of America. So we have to break ourselves free of just simply repeating over and over the stock narrative that has us high on our own delusions. So once we do that, it really is a matter of then breaking free of the sense that only through individual action can change come about, because that's not the way that it has worked throughout the course of human history, right? What happens is we understand that we have a responsibility to one another. It's difficult because in this country, we can't even agree that it's good to wear a mask to protect your neighbor from an airborne illness that has caused a global pandemic. We can't even get to that point. So I know that we're up against something incredibly tough that's ingrained in the American character, in the American identity of who we are as rugged individualists and people who just take care of ourselves. And if everyone does that, then we're all better off. We're not there. We're not that. That's not how it works as a human. The reason that Homo sapiens have been able to survive all this time, a large part of it is it's not just the thumbs, right? It's the fact that we are social creatures. We depend on each other. We help each other. And if we lose sight of that, which we have, especially in an American context, we've lost sight of the idea that we have responsibility to care for each other on a large scale. Right. Well, then we have no hope whatsoever.
Reading through your story truly fascinated me. I mean, you were at the forefront of opposing the war in Vietnam. You were one of the key individuals who fought for the American government to impose sanctions on the apartheid government in South Africa. You've been fighting for equality in America for a long time. You've been on the front lines, and you're a friend of Dr. King's family. If you look at MLK Day today, and you look at how people have warped his message and his image, etc., what do you think is the biggest misconception people have about Dr. King?
The biggest misconception is that Martin Luther King was a dreamer who had a dream. Every time I go someplace, people get up and say, yes, he was a dreamer. He was always dreaming. Well, that's because of the speech and the part that's taken out. Martin Luther King believed in the right to vote. The first speech he gave in Washington at the prayer pilgrimage in 1957, his coming out, as it were, in Washington, was about if we ever got the vote, everything would change. We'd have justice if we just got the vote. That was even after, a year before, they had done the boycott, the Montgomery boycott. But over the years, as he evolved, he saw, hey, the vote is important and we should get it, and he continued to fight for it. But voting by itself isn't going to give us justice. And he concluded that protest is an essential ingredient of politics. You see, politicians want two things. They want you to vote for them, and they want to get elected, and they want you to vote for them so they can get reelected. Right. Those are the two things they want. But the thing you have to want is to make them do what will give you justice and equality in this country, and they won't do that unless you make them do it. That's where protest is involved. Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence. He learned about it, he believed in it, he and Coretta believed in it. It was at the center of their lives. When I say protest is an essential ingredient of politics, I mean nonviolent protest. And the book is about the kind of nonviolent protests you can engage in, which will make change. It will make government officials who you elected actually do what they promised they would do. Isn't that unique? How interesting that they would actually promise to do something and even try to do it. But that's what, and the other thing the book is about is how every generation has to make its own dent in the wall of injustice. Young people, you have to pass it on. Mm-hmm. All the movements that I talk about in that book, in which I was involved and at the center of some of them, it didn't happen overnight. You didn't go out and have one march, or you didn't go out and have two marches. We went on for years until we were able to make change. So young people have to pick up the torch and move forward with it and make their own dent.
On the other side of freedom, the case for hope.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're hopeful about America's trajectory?
Yeah. I think about hope as a belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays. And I think about hope as like real work, not hope as magic.
Right.
And I am hopeful. My faith wavers a little bit. Faith is about certainty. And like sometimes I'm not certain we're going to win. But do I think that we can win? I'm hopeful in that way.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you're someone who's been on, the front lines of many discussions. It was Black Lives Matter. You're one of the faces that people turn to try and explain the idea. I mean, people were like, is this anti-cop? Is this anti-white people? Is this anti-everything that is not black? And you had to speak on that. And, you've spoken out on many issues. You've seen yourself as somebody who wants to speak about what's happening in the world. The book is about a combination of two things. It's you and your personal life,
Yep.
and then the world that we now live in today. How do you think who you are as DeRAY McKesson affected how you see the world today?
Yeah, it was important for me to talk about some of the personal stuff. I've never written about being a gay black man in the movement or in the world. I write about that. My mother left when I was 3, came back when I was 30.
Right.
I write about these things because they shape the way that I think about memory, the way that I think about identity. But then I write about some of the stuff that you'd expect, right? Like the police, the protests. I'll ask you, name something you can buy for $300.
Name something you can buy for $300. 7 copies of Madden.
Today in Florida, theft over $300 is a felony, and if you become a felon, you permanently lose the right to vote, which is wild, right? But when people think about felons, they think that everybody like robbed a bank,
Right,
killed 10 people.
right.
But it's like, imagine like losing the right to vote as an 18-year-old because you like stole seven copies?
Yeah.
7
Well,
copies.
not me. No, not me. But
7 copies of Madden.
Right. And you know what's
That's
funny
wild.
is you talk about all of these things. Like there's a section in the book here where you really go into the statistics. And what's interesting is when you're talking about police violence specifically, you speak about police violence across the board. So it's not like a black issue, just go Americans. This is how many American people have been killed by the police. And you have a year where 1,000 people were shot by the police, which is a high number for any country in the world. And then you see a disproportionate number of that amount of people being black as well. What was even scarier was that these statistics weren't being counted in any way, shape, or form.
If you get killed in this country and a newspaper doesn't write about you, you literally don't exist in the database because the government doesn't keep the data. So we know the rainfall in Missouri in 1830 and literally don't know anything about police violence in the past year. That's sort of while 1/3 of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is actually killed by an officer. Like 1 in 11 homicides in California is actually committed by an officer. So this is like it's a big deal. And part of the data work we did was like myth busting. Black people are actually more likely to be unarmed and not threatening somebody than any other person who encounters a police in a violent situation. That's like, people don't know that stuff. So we wanted to like lay it bare so people could not perpetuate these myths about the movement.
When they call you a terrorist, a story of Black Lives Matter and the power to change the world. Your memoir is really touching because you don't just talk about activism, you talk about your life and how you got into activism. I was really touched by how you talk about how you grew up in a Jehovah's Witness family, and you talk about how your mother was kicked out of the house for being pregnant at 16. And then you talk about how later on you were then shunned by your family for coming out as queer. Do you think that has imbued within yourself an affinity for all those groups of people who are marginalized in society?
Absolutely. I feel deeply connected to, say, the underdog, to marginalized communities, because I lived it firsthand as a young person growing up in a working class, poor family, witnessing my single mom have to really be a single mother and not get the support, not just from her family, but also not get the support from the state, from the government, and witnessing my father and my brother be in and out of prison. I think that really impacted me both personally, but once I became an activist, I realized, this is a much bigger system, and I can shape that system, and I can be a part of a movement that shapes that system.
When you went out to Ferguson, I don't think even you anticipated, from what I read in the book, how big this movement would become. I mean, at one point you were arrested for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Of course, I was one of dozens of reporters who at some point got arrested in Ferguson. It was fascinating because when I first went to Ferguson, I was a political reporter. I covered Congress, and I thought that I'd be dropping it for a day, I'd write a cute little story or something, maybe I'd write something for the weekend, and I thought I'd be home by that weekend drinking with my buddies where we always go out. And instead, I landed and I could immediately sense, like you could feel it in the air, that this is something bigger, that this anger has really boiled over in a way that it had not previously. And we watch as we go from city to city, as new activists spring up who get involved, new shootings occur, and you just have this feeling throughout these last 2 years that this is something bigger than just one story, than just an isolated incident, than just the story of Michael Brown or Eric Gardner or Sandra Bland, that rather this is part of a movement that is caramelizing.
There's something fascinating that you wrote here that I connected with. Yeah, I'll read the passage. You said, there's no right way to approach these interviews. In the moment, you are literally walking up to a heartbroken human, someone struggling to avoid becoming completely engulfed by a wave of pain and confusion, and asking them to find words to express those feelings and thoughts. And the 24-hour news cycle doesn't help because it so often prompts reporters to ask either cliched, leading soundbite bait or process questions to which the response of the dead man or family's woman adds little, which is a really strong indictment, because what you're saying is essentially, because the cycle is based on entertainment, 24-hour news needs something that is catchy and grabby. You can't ask a person how they feel. You need it to fit in one sentence.
Of course, we are talking about the fundamental issue at the basis of the foundation of this nation, right? Race in America, race and justice. And we're walking up to you after your son has just been killed, and we're saying, so how do you feel? So do you think you're gonna get justice?
Yeah.
And then we're cutting you off after 15 seconds to put you on the evening news, right? We're going to a protest where you've been marching for 5 hours, you've been crying, you've carried a sign, maybe you've flown into town to participate in this, and we're giving you half a sentence in the newspaper. So why are you out here tonight? That's not a way to have a conversation about this, to deal with the nuances, to deal with the complexities. I think one of the things I tried to do in this book was tell the stories of the activists who I met as I've gone city to city.
Yeah, you did a great job with that.
Because I believe that if you can understand one of these activists as a human, not as a caricature, not as, oh, that crazy radical from the TV that night, but as a three-dimensional human being, their motivations, their fears, why they're in those streets, if you can understand one of the people in the streets, then perhaps you can understand the 1,000 people and the 100,000 people that make up this type of movement. And so that's kind of what I seek to do, is how do we seize the humanity of the people behind these headlines? Because whether you agree with the protest movement or not, these are real human beings in the streets in pain. And if you can't empathize with that, there's nowhere for our conversation to go.
Give me an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish with this book.
That's a great question. I think Thick was about it. That Thick was the last essay I wrote in this book, and when we titled it, it all sort of came together for me, and it was this. There's this theme running through the history of Black women's experience of this country and of the world that is about us being nuanced, and sometimes too nuanced for the world to perceive us as we perceive ourselves. And it was in that nuance where I wanted people to get comfortable. We're not usually very comfortable in places where we don't have easy black and white answers.
Right.
And this book is about complicating all of that, but in a way that centers the experiences of Black women as being human experiences, which is what I thought, if there's any contribution of this book, it is that.
It's interesting that you say that, because for many Black women in America, they have always said that the definition of being a Black woman in America is one that seems to be defined by others.
That is correct.
So they go, you're the angry Black woman,
That's
you're
right.
the sassy Black woman, oh, you're smart for a Black woman. It seems like there's always some sort of qualifier that comes with that. You're trying to dissect those ideas. The book is really in-depth, but at the same time easy to understand. Why did you break it into essays as opposed to just writing one long book?
Well, I don't know that one long book would be enough for the story of Black women. Oddly enough, essays are a better approach because you can take these slices of our life, and you run the risk of people thinking that this is a definitive book on what it is to be a Black woman. I mean, so one of the things that happens when you're a Black woman and you have some public personalities, you become everybody's Black friend who doesn't have an actual Black friend.
Right.
And I didn't want to give the impression that by reading one definitive text about Black women, you knew everything there was to know about Black women. What this does instead is give you a slice of life and the thinking and the philosophy of Black womanhood as I understand it, not just as someone who lives it and has experienced it, but someone who has studied it and thought about it at these different levels. So essays allow me to sort of slice those sections of our life experiences off in a way that I think a single narrative wouldn't allow me to do.
You talk in the book about how, you know, publications, for instance, don't hire enough black women as voices to constantly contribute. You know, they just want to jump in and be like, hey, there's a black issue.
That's
black
right.
lady, can you just jump in and write this for us? But we're not going to hire you permanently.
Yes.
Why do you think that's so important in the conversations that America has in and around its politics or social issues?
You know, it's important on a couple of levels. It's important to black women because we deserve it, right? If you have earned the spot to contribute to the public discourse, then you should be at publications that help shape that kind of discourse.
Right.
And our opinion pages, those mastheads, as much as we like to think that they no longer matter, indeed, in the age of social media, they may matter more and not less, because we tend to turn to the publications that we trust more when news becomes more difficult to trust, right? And if those are going to be the publications that we trust, it should look like the people whose trust we are asking for. So that's one reason. The other reason is I believe that the philosophy that black women have developed over hundreds of years says as much about black womanhood as it says about everyone else's experiences. And frankly, I just think we're smarter if we listen to black women. And it's not to say that black women are always right, but black women do always have a right to be heard, right? And when you don't model what it means to take black women seriously in our public discourse, it reinforces the idea that people don't have to take us seriously.
In many ways, you argue that Obama's presidency and black leadership in any way, shape, or form is in some way contributing to white supremacy, which is a very complicated argument. What do you mean when you say that in the book?
I wouldn't quite put it. I would say it's not, you know, like I don't think Obama did anything but be a human being and, you know, go into the office and just happen to be somebody to check black on the census form. It's the reaction to that.
Right.
It's always the reaction to the ordinariness, to the bourgeoisness, to the middle classness of, you know, normal everyday black people, and how well that accords with what this country claims to value. That's always a threat, because it automatically undermines the suppositions of white supremacy, which says that black people, you know, don't take care of their kids. Black people are, you know, always, you know, killing each other, ending up in jail. Like there's a kind of moral judgment that can always be made on black people. This goes back to, you know, justifications to slavery. And black folks who present themselves, you know, in a particular way as undermining that, it's always a threat to the thinking about white supremacy. I think that's why folks were so offended by Obama. You know, like they couldn't grasp that he was actually black. And so they became this whole other mythology that sprung up around them, most, you know, specifically in this birtherism thing. Somehow he's not legitimate.
He could not be from here because he's not the black that we believe black to be.
Exactly, and there's another word that I cannot use up here, but I think that they actually want. That's the archetype of what that is, but that he would be black and be human in all the, again, not exceptional, all the normal ways of a human being. Kiss your wife, love your wife, got a dog, you know, 2 kids, just normal human every day. Was too much, you know what I mean? And I think that contributed to the birtherism, you know, all the sort of weird conspiracy theories that, you know, sprung up around him.